Don't worry about that. It hasn't happened yet. Okay.
Oh my goodness, they are piling in.
Habari za Riyadh.
Habari.
Alaikum salam.
Kim, and turn it over to you. And when you need me, I will share screen and put up the video.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. I hope everyone's hearing me clearly. Seems they are. Good to see a few folks there who I've met before. Maybe we'll have more still join us. Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. I think he said most I really need to say. I do say my ministry is in 4 areas, no particular order. Looking after orphan children, ministry with the Coptic Orthodox Church. So it's good to see my colleague here, Riyadh. Bible teaching to indigenous and other churches using Luo and Swahili, and then writing and study, particularly under the auspices of the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission. So in terms of today's presentation, let's say that it was motivated in part by my looking at a video produced by Paul Bender Samuel on Amri Connect, in which Paul Bender Samuel said this: the capability and capacity for rigorous mission research and publishing is still largely located in the minority Christian world of North America and Europe. And this imbalance of resources inevitably leads to the continued domination of mission theories and practices developed in Western contexts. And that was a deep concern for many of us. They're quoting Paul Bender Samuel. He goes on to say, we are committed to the start to be multilingual, and I apologize that this Zoom call will be largely English. The platform is designed for 8 languages. And then Kwaushie says this: we are very much interested in mother tongues of the world. So much expression there of interest in the language issue that kind of prompted me to write an email to Paul Bender Samuel and say, hey, can I come along, even if by Zoom, to give a presentation, which he acknowledged we could do that. So I think at this point, if Tom has the video ready to roll, go ahead, please, Tom.
Okay, we'll start putting it up here. Let me just find the right one. Where is it here? Oh, that's not it.
That's the video that includes the introduction I've already given, if you want to show that one.
Okay, well, let me, yeah, I don't see it on my screen, which is really bad. Why is it doing that? Oh, here it is. Okay, all right. So, yeah, it's fine. We'll use this one. Okay.
But then you probably jump the first part because they've
Hey,
already given the first part.
At the end of mission studies, I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but
Okay, let me
this is
skip
by
it forward.
Paul Bender Samuel's
Okay, there we
comments,
go.
or will be largely English. Just because the
Okay.
Paul's mentioning that concern inspired me to write again to say, look, can I contribute in this area? Paul subsequently says the following: we are committed to the study, presumably then it is to be done in English. So before coming back to Amri Connect, here's my main paper. Let me repeat the title: The Case Against English in Africa and the Majority World and its Implications for Christian Mission Today. Note, while I make overt reference to English in this article, I implicitly consider other European languages to be in the same category. I refer to Africans in general rather to a particular country or tribe in Africa, so as not to make out that any one group is radically different from others. Part 1, what English is doing in Africa. Premier education being in English and coming from the West automatically, although some do not seem to realize this, turns African innovation into error, or into a corrupting influence on an ideal. Use of English for formal purposes in Africa therefore renders development on indigenous terms and following local thinking an impossibility. A personal experience of a look at a report of a child in a secondary school in Kenya. The student concerned received a grade of 6% in chemistry. Out of 80 or so students in their class, that 6% put the person concerned into 28th position in the class. That is to say, 53 out of 80 students got 6% or less in chemistry that year. The cause for this seems to be very clear. Students could not understand what they were being told in English by the teacher. That failure to understand no doubt started from when they entered school, thus rendering much, if not most, of what they were taught in 15 years of formal schooling indecipherable. Language is run with cultures or ways of life. English comes with its own logic that is imposed onto African communities using formal channels. Indigenous languages continue to run on a very different logic. This results in two systems of life, both being considered worthy. For practical and other reasons, African countries do not and cannot instantaneously cancel their indigenous origins. The indigenous can be said to continue indefinitely. This results in a duplicity of truth. For example, I will come in indigenous languages may say more about goodwill than anticipated actions. In English, it is intended to foretell action. When both languages and cultures are in force, one cannot tell whether action is intended or not. The West today, hearing of Africa in English almost invariably means that they hear what is familiar. Even when something unfamiliar is communicated, it will be expressed in familiar terms. Languages of sports, taking sports as cultures, clearly illustrate this. If tennis, compared with African culture, has to be described using soccer, compared with Western culture language, then in the description, tennis will acquire goals, translations of a set, or maybe a net ball, throw-ins, the ball boy throwing the ball back to the tennis players, handballs, backhanders, and some halftime whistles, end of set, and so on. This is how the West hears Africa. The embeddedness of English in African communities, combined with the misguided impression that the foreign, in the above example tennis, is familiar, i.e. is soccer, emboldens Westerners to think that they understand what is going on in Africa, and therefore into directing what goes on, or at least into making suggestions or giving guidance with potential associated financial backing. This, combined with the formal system being completely bound to the West, results in direction of economic, social, and related activities on an almost day-to-day basis in all sectors, including the domestic, being given by very ignorant outsiders. Use of English properly learned is a powerful means for indigenous people to signal the presence of abilities, aptitudes, orientations, successes, and competencies that may be totally or largely absent. Such signaling is especially likely if some material or other reward is contingent on the presence of a presupposed competence. This plays havoc with processes which could have occurred were the absence, skill, or aptitude present. Should the presence of such an aptitude or skill be reflected in imitated English language use, the implication that it is there then negates the need for it to be learned. Thus, it blocks the road to any potential avenues of remedial education or provision of needed information. For example, an orientation to efficiency being almost universally presupposed in formal English discourse will mean that African people will communicate as if they are au fait with concepts of efficiency, even when, clearly for those in the know, actually they are not. Part 2. How has English come to this position? Our day presents challenges unknown in the history of the world. One recent revolution has been that of communication. Diverse technologies, including television, radio, the printing press, but especially the internet, have enabled linguistic options that in the past were totally out of the picture. They enable discourses extant in one part of the world to instantaneously travel to billions of others. Such discourses, in our case in English from the West to the rest, can be adopted by people who share few or none of the West's foundational presuppositions or contexts. On meeting European people engaging with Africa, I'm often struck by the assumption communicated that their particular action is so parochial and of such a small scale as to have little universal consequence. Yet add these up, whether they be by individual churches, schools, universities, and others in the West, each doing their small thing, and we have a massive use of English and advocating for English descending onto Africa from the native English-speaking world and beyond. The notion that they're only doing a small thing simultaneously acts as an excuse not to do things properly, i.e., not to engage Africans using their own languages. The people engaging draw economic balance sheets in such a way as frequently to provide massive material incentives in favor of cooperation with them. This is especially likely with a new project, where the reasoning is used that support is needed to get things off the ground that will then be handed over. English does not impose itself onto Africa because African people like it as a language, but because they value the economic and prestige, etc., benefits that it brings. This means that the capability of English to facilitate indigenous processes without foreign subsidy is rarely, if ever, tested. The final piece of the jigsaw needed to solve the puzzle of the power of global English in Africa, that is particularly sensitive in some circles, is a major efforts being made by powerful formal and informal actors in the West at stamping out racism. That is often portrayed as being a dislike for someone else's skin color. Anti-racism embodies much of the negative that we explore in this article. It comprises of a determined effort, typically legally and morally backed by large swaths of Western populations, as well as non-Western people living within their midst, at ignoring issues facing majority world people through subsidy and means of positive discrimination that endeavors to squelch evidence of profound cultural difference. When, as happens today, thinking that takes the above squelching seriously becomes globalized, then African and other majority world people have to, even in their homelands, be treated as if they're culturally, behaviorally, in their conceptions and understanding and so on, identical to Westerners. Part 3, real dangers of English for Africa. I've already alluded to many dangers of use of English in Africa that I here re-articulate in summary form. Use of English dummifies African peoples. It either stops them from thinking for themselves, not knowing the cultural roots of the language they're required to use, or it renders their own thoughts politically and economically unacceptable. Formally, only discourse that closely imitates Western equivalents in English is found acceptable. The Corona Epidemic graphically illustrated this to those aware, having been deceived by some of the mechanisms already described that result from widespread use of English in Africa. Preventative orientations to Corona from the West of Africa effectively presupposed the universality of a biomedical worldview and clear comprehension of scientifically rooted English. Seems clear to me that most African countries played the normal game, as far as possible satisfying Western donors by pretending that they were doing what they were asked. A notable exception, Tanzania, who expressed their African comprehension blatantly, was widely condemned. The undermining of people's own sensibilities in the absence of an effective alternative, the supposed alternative understanding of English is only skin deep and remains oriented primarily to acquisition of funds, comprises a very serious attack. The incompetence and gross dependence on foreigners in almost every part of Africa constitutes an enormous vulnerability. While things tick over, this can be more ignored and may not be very visible. When the system is tested, it may collapse. Corona provided a good example of this. The nature of this challenge was largely concealed from public view in the West. In the absence of outside props, the collapse of Western structures in indigenous contexts could easily become catastrophic in the scale of its impact. It might be added that the ongoing production of incompetence within Africa, especially combined with growing rates of emigration to the West, will certainly stoke racist fires within the West, requiring ever more adamant and insistent anti-racist measures. Part 4, why the blind myopia on English in Africa? Contemporary linguists are motivated, of course, in part by the need for anti-racism, adamantly clinging to unrealistic notions of interlingual functional equality. They claim that African languages would be as effective as our European languages in through education supporting modernity, and the development considered associated with it is a sacred cow considered not to be tampered with. African parents' own almost continent-wide orientation to desperately pushing their children into European languages is considered to be based in ignorance. These deceptions result in formal efforts by supposedly neutral scholars supporting ongoing blanket application of European languages over almost all of Africa. This despite the total absence of such an inherently disastrous orientation within the West and other powerful countries not struggling with massive inequalities themselves. Today's public ignorance can only be explained, it seems, by this author, by reference to gigantic influences of extremely powerful and secularly grounded vested interests. It results in extremely naive presuppositions about translation. An example from East Africa, the symptoms of AIDS are such that a term in the Luo language, Chira, is by default a prime choice for its translation. Yet, whereas AIDS seeks to orient people to scientific solutions, Shira directs them to perform rituals that please their departed ancestors. Very few scholars appraising international relations, the media, and other sectors these days pay significant attention to the question of the direction of translation. That translation should come from unknown to known, i.e., it should be done by a mother tongue speaker of the target language. They thus implicitly appropriate a linguistic model that assumes that terms representing concepts in one tongue can simply be re-expressed using terms in another language. This poor foundation of understanding underlies almost all communication between Africa and the West. Africa is expected to be guided by Western wisdom, fed and translated into educational curricula and into the media all around the continent. Simultaneously, Western countries, so as to avoid accusations of racism, increasingly rely on foreign nationals' translations into English to be foundational to creation of the bedrock of their knowledge of others. In both cases, the linguistic cultural translation considered legitimate is that presented by native people to foreigners. This system's, as a result, effectively taking no account of how that knowledge will be or is appropriated into the other foreign environment is seriously erroneous. Examples: an African person telling a Westerner they have a friend in the West implies uninterested friendship, which in many parts of Africa, in which friendships are entered into for material reasons, is highly unlikely. In reverse, a Westerner telling an African person to ignore the supernatural may make almost no sense to the latter, to whom supernatural is not a perceivable category. The enormous perceived success of secular liberal policies in the Western world have prompted some, seeing no need for change to any alternative, to declare the end of history. The powerful lobby that this vision represents uses anti-racism and other means to conceal, they hope indefinitely, liberalism's Achilles heels. The Achilles heel I'm here exposing is a cost to the poor, to victims, to African people, to illegitimate unborn babies, to young girls in a crisis of confidence about their own anticipated womanhood, etc., who, not being given any room to express themselves honestly in the modern world, potentially face obliteration. Some solutions. Who is going to break the glass and pull that emergency trigger and say this is a BY joke? Asks Monk, after realizing that African people who consider Jeffrey Sachs' means of achieving Millennium Development Goals to be ludicrous and never gonna work, nevertheless assure him and other visitors that their donations are going to good use. The tendency to prioritize speaking for money over truth I believe to be strong, especially where the formal legitimization of two systems of governance in parallel, secular Western and traditional, has already compromised or destroyed truth. Thus, the West's orientation to the majority world has in effect become one in which a select African elite is paid to say pleasing things, regardless of reality and outcome on the ground. Someone needs to speak out on this. B. The foundations to contemporary European systems of governance were laid when populations that had together gone through the Enlightenment were relatively homogeneous. High levels of immigration to, say, the UK challenged those systems. And in many ways, healthy recent reaction has been that of humble acceptance by European people of their own faults and weaknesses. They've accepted the need to overcome ethnocentrism by tolerating others as equals. Humility before God, having been less forthcoming, has resulted in a denial of God's influence on forming contemporary Europeans. An outcome of concealing God's work is an imposed, assumed normalization of European ways amongst immigrant populations. The latter must be considered normal on a European scale. Unfortunately, assuming immigrants to be already like Europeans, when extended to nationals in their home countries, conceals the role the gospel played in making Europeans who they are today. Occluding the need for the gospel acts in the interests of secularism, hence the need to overcome today's anti-racism that epitomizes the global normalization of European ways in the interests of the gospel and the sheer survival of majority world populations. C. Amongst the impacts of efforts at avoiding ethnocentrism and racism has been a reluctance to communicate honestly about other than European-like features of the life of African and majority world people. That such honesty could in today's world seem ethnocentric and proud points to a theological dearth. Western academia and governance have been actively endeavoring to ignore theology as more than a private affair for generations. This has left them bereft of knowledge of their own godly foundations. That is to say, the strengths the West has are not due to Westerners' single intelligence or stainless morality, but to prior generations' experience of God's grace. Denying others around the world the same knowledge of grace through promotion of secular systems amounts to a kicking away of the ladder that the West used to get where it is. In short, one is not proud if one gives glory to God for one's abilities. Honesty about the majority world using translation from unknown to known requires Westerners with experience in Africa, and not Africans who have learned English, to be the informers to the West about conditions on the ground in Africa. D. In this article addressed the Church. The Church should not follow the world, including false counters to ethnocentrism and racism that result in the faulty ahistorical universalizing normalization of European ways globally. God sends his people into the world to preach the gospel, baptize and make disciples, not to delegate this role to others. The West needs to prioritize sending missionaries to all parts of the globe. The problems recently faced resulting in condemnation of missionary activity as neo-colonial can be overcome by the practice of vulnerable mission. Missionaries to engage their ministries entirely using indigenous languages, not European languages, and resources coming from the people they are reaching. This, of course, is a practice we refer to as vulnerable mission. So a few comments referring more specifically to Amory Connect as I understand it. I don't have a profound understanding, but I've looked into a little. One question, will Amory Connect accept the legitimacy of research that is not built on secular epistemological foundations?
Tom, can you cut this here? Are you hearing me?
Yeah. And you want me to stop,
Secondly,
stop sharing?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay, so let me just finish live. I hope everyone's hearing me.
Yeah.
It seems they are. So what I take Amory Connect as a case study. I don't know much about it, but I think you folks know about it, and I think the principles apply much more widely. What about not secular epistemology? Number two, when it comes to international, let's say, theological cooperation, I suggest we must prohibit translation. Translation from English to mother tongue must be by mother tongue speakers who've lived 10 years in the West. And that's not for a conference, that's to educate English people. Sorry, African people. Translation from mother tongue to English must be by mother tongue speakers who've lived 10 years there. So the information about Africa coming to the West should come from those who've had exposure to Africa. Otherwise, we'll continue dominating and misunderstanding each other. So in theoretical terms, if Amory Connect is serious about being multilingual, then every language, the channel of every language must be secret to that language and must never be translated into English, so as to embolden users of that language to speak in a way in which they don't have to first think, well, this is translated into English, how will it sound?
Mm.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jim, and fascinating topic. It covered a lot of areas, and we will open this up to questions and responses. At the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button, and if you hit that and then put your raise hand, I will call on you to ask Jim a question or make a comment. I guess my comment to you, Jim, is very interesting because your work comes out of Africa. My work comes out of Asia and China. And the relationship of Chinese to English and English to Chinese is probably different than the kind of relationships of English to Luo or some of those other areas. And part of that has been, for instance, the rise in Asia economically as a force and a power. So one of the things that the Chinese are doing all the time is they're mastering English, but they're also then strengthening their own linguistic capabilities in Chinese. And what you have is an ongoing movement into modernity that is in a constant state of flux. And I guess my comment is that this is such a live, fluid thing going on. It's hard to set rules. You know, as one who taught in China, watched this happening, was fascinated by it. I was amazed at the adaptability and the power of the Chinese and the Chinese thinking to adapt and actually go beyond to gain advantage through their understandings and language, but also through mastering of the English and then learning how to translate and work with it in ways that benefited them. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I cannot claim to be an expert on China or Asia. I do get the impression that contexts in Asia are very different, but yet those contexts in Asia are also contexts in which mother tongues are used. South Korea is an example where they continue their language and they benefit from the English, but they don't try and make their people into English speakers. I was at a conference in South Korea a few months ago by Zoom, and that became very clear indeed. In a country like China, again, as a non-expert, my impression is we're not quickly going to be able to determine what happens in China the African situation, I think, is very different.
Yeah.
Technically, of course, African countries are independent, but that independence is in the light of massive dependencies. Now, although what we're discussing goes right across the military and political arena, of course, our concern is the mission work and the government do.
We're going to let Jim catch up, and then I'm going to tell him to turn off his video so we can hear him better. So just give it a little bit of patience. Because he's
and if you take Hong Kong and Singapore, who somehow get by now, sealed.
Jim, are you there?
Hello, I've come back.
Yeah, Jim, why don't you turn off your video and just go
Okay.
audio, and that way your bandwidth won't be so bad. Okay, there we go. So yeah, go ahead. We had some hands raised, so I'm going to go to the next question. And Tim, go ahead. Tim Keene. Did we lose Tim too? Where's Tim? I saw Tim's hand up. Second. Oh, Tim's gone. Anyone else have a question? I saw Tim. Oh, go ahead, Al.
Thank you so much. Have we lost our speaker now?
I'm here, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, Jim, I see.
Yeah.
Jim, thank you. I speak from Latin America, and you hear me like an Englishman, but I'm actually a Chilean because I'm bicultural and therefore bilinguistic. Puedo hablar en castellano perfectamente bien, igual que un inglés. I can speak in Spanish or English and think in Spanish and pray in Spanish and English. So a lot of what you're saying deeply interests me from the Latin American point of view. But I'm not going to get into the fineries of language here, simply ask you on the mission, what you were talking about mission. I was fascinated by your analysis that grace produces a Europe, and that therefore, I mean, following the logic, would what Wycliffe Bible translators, to be specific, and the way they do it, providing the scriptures in the local languages, be a means for such a grace? Would we expect, could it happen that that's perhaps one of the best things we can possibly do, so that grace will come to cultures through the scriptures, through the word of God, in their own language? Would this go towards the sort of goals that you would hope mission can accomplish? I know it's just one small example, but it would seem to me from what you're saying in your thesis that it's pretty central. I've come to the end of my question.
Yeah, well, I think, go ahead, Jim, if you can respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Wi-Fi system usually operational by the Coptic Church isn't operational today for some reason. Bible translation, I mean, in many ways excellent. At the same time, they use enormous amounts of outside resources, so that raises many issues. If it wasn't for the formal Western-based Bible translation movement, one tribe may be translating a Bible from another tribe into their own language. Instead, these days, Bible translation is a way of language. The chances are a lot of you are going to become wealthy as a result. Another aspect of the Bible translation concern is that outside of Bible translation, most missionaries ignore the translated Bibles. Well, they want their students to have them, but they don't learn the language. So theological education goes on in English, in French, whatever it is. And people are not daft. You know, they realize the power is not in their own languages. Now, you have to smile when your translation comes out and have a photo taken and say it's wonderful, but that's about as far goes. Education in indigenous languages. Now, frankly, the people should be doing that are the indigenous people, yes. But as long as we're involved in advising them or providing education and they're dependent on us, then I think it's also important to have Western people who actually become informed as to what is happening on the ground. There's this notion that if you're kind of chairing events, you don't need to know the language, but the language is everything in the people's way of life and culture. The person with the power should also be the person who is comprehending the language, which means really you're talking about 10 years of using that language.
Okay, we're going to go with Riyadh. Go ahead, Riyadh. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jim. I have two different questions. The first I would relate to Al, to what he said, that he has no problem with Spanish and English. But let me put this differently. Spanish is already the foreign language that came to the Latin America, and it's already put to death the Guarani, the Aymara, the Quechua, all the indigenous languages. So can you expect that the case in Latin America would be this, the Africa would be the same, like with difference with 200 years or 300 years with Africa? Like the case would be the death of the indigenous languages in 200 years from now?
We can't hear you, Riyadh. Did you accidentally hit mute?
No. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Now?
Keep
Okay,
going.
so my question is,
I heard him.
Because we saw in Latin America many movements to bring back the indigenous languages, and some governments have taken this seriously, and they are trying to teach it back at the schools. So how can we learn from this story? My second question is totally different thing. It's kind of a Christian question when it comes to the call of the mission work. Can we put it as criteria or an element of discerning God's call for a mission is the language, and the tribal language, local language, indigenous language of the place the person is going to, or it's something that after it's decided, then we will see what will happen after we land, if we can say that this will come later. So my question is, from a Christian point of view, can this be a deciding element or factor in a decision of mission work?
Thank you very much, Riyadh, for those two questions. The death of languages and reviving languages as apparently practiced in Latin America. Now, I think my concern is not, we don't want to lose every single language in Africa. And this is where I would be in favor, let's say, of Swahili. The point being, Swahili belongs to Tanzania. So Swahili is theirs, and they do what they want to do with it. And Swahili tallies with their way of life and their way of thinking, which English doesn't. So this title was against English rather than pro mother tongues. Now, there may be other good reasons to maintain mother tongues, but there are also other drawbacks of maintaining mother tongues, particularly like in Tanzania, if you have 120 of them, which is not my main point, but the point being, can the people be allowed to speak in a way that makes sense to them? And then the onus is on the outsider to grasp what they're saying by having their person on the ground who can then translate back, not in a sentence by sentence form, but can give the West a good idea of what's actually going on the ground. In terms of calling, yeah, I think what we need to be going to is basically a mandatory you will engage with those people in their own language only. Now, I'm sure that won't go down well with many new missionaries, at least it wouldn't in my experience, because they tend to be poorly informed about linguistic issues, as are many Brits and many Americans. If they were to be enlightened about what's actually going on, then they could take that seriously. And another aspect into Oxford is the fact that these days, if the scholars back in the West listen, let's take again an example of Tanzania, to a Tanzanian speaking to them about Tanzania in English, then a potential new missionary to Tanzania is kind of getting a slap in the face. I've been told I need to learn the language, I need to learn the culture. Now, my bosses and my seniors in the UK, without going through all that, have become experts on Tanzania. In other words, we should stop listening to people from other language groups and cultures telling us about what's happening in their contexts. We, as native English speakers, we need to have our own people on the ground in those contexts, learning the language and engaging it over an extended period, and they need to be our informers. Otherwise, we are killing intercultural mission before it ever really gets off the ground.
Okay, let's go with Tim. Go ahead, Tim.
Yes, I was interested, this is a bit of an aside, I was interested by your comments about South Korea, because I'm married to Korean, and I'm always amazed at how often a sermon, they'll suddenly interject some phrase like, we're saved by faith. They do that, you know, in a Korean sermon, all in Korean, except suddenly this interjection of a phrase that they obviously think is especially powerful. So anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but English is not completely excluded from Korean theological discussion. I lived in Africa for about 2 years, and it's not so much pre-COVID as pre-AIDS. This is in the 70s. And I lived in Zambia. And the thing about Zambia is that its national language is English. And if they were to opt for, as a national language, any of the local languages, they would get 3/4 of the country in rebellion, because there are 4 main language groups. And if you opted for one of those language groups, the other 3/4, other language groups would be up in arms. So they have to have English as their national language. Now, this probably has some pluses and minuses, but one plus is that, of course, it automatically links them into a wider world. But that means that English increasingly is the language of people in Zambia. They might well be retain, certainly in the 70s, they all retained a local language, but they went to English churches, English language churches. All their study at school was in English and so forth. So English remained a kind of key part. Is there, does this imply that English actually retains a very important role in mission in certain African countries? And that's the first thing. The second,
Can I ask them that straight off before you go on to the second? Because I've got fading memory capability.
Yeah, well, so have I.
Part of the answer is, insofar as we are the originators of native English, are we responsible for solving people's domestic quarrels? That excuse goes on and on and on. It's saying, look, you British folks, you're so wonderful. Without your language, we'd all be fighting each other. If they can do no better, what's going on? As I say, we have 2 logics going on. We need the money logic, and we have an actual logic. So let's say foreign donors pulled the plug on English subsidy in Zambia, and everyone spoke Bemba. Would they all kill each other? I doubt it. Would they say they wouldn't kill each other? Well, of course they wouldn't, because then they'd lose the subsidy. This very excuse all over Africa. We have so many, even Rwanda. Rwanda has only 1 language, but still French and English are dominant. I think that is a kind of a red herring excuse. But frankly, in terms of this presentation, I'm talking about mission. You can look at the large scale issues that are relevant. Someone wanting to be involved in mission in Zambia. Basically, I say bypass English, because if you don't, you'll make a mess. Just bypass it. Just go to a tribe, go to a people. Now, initially, before you do anything, you might have to use English to say, can you give me a loaf of bread and where's the supermarket? But if you're going to engage any serious ministry, do it in the local language. And that, in a sense, is all I'm saying. And I think if that were to happen, or if more than 1 or 2 or 3 people were to do that, they'd be sending back reports saying something like what I'm saying, stop English in Africa. Now, not at government level, and I'm not saying we should be dictating to African countries or to Western governments, although both, if they realize what's going on, I think they would also say, hey, this is crazy. We can't be oppressing Africa like this. We have to stop this English stuff. But I'm talking about really a missionary going and using that indigenous tongue. So there's, I think, a response to your question, if I've got all of it. Please, the second part.
Well, that's really to do with a language. To what extent, this is where my lack of linguistics catches me out terribly, but to what extent is a language limit, does language limit the logic? So what I mean is that languages develop over time, and so therefore they wrestle with different logics, and they can wrestle with logics that come from a different culture. And as they wrestle, they develop new ways of communicating, and they can learn from the logics of other nationalities. So to what extent might the English, let's say in Zambia, so if we stick with Zambia, to what extent might the English start to develop its own Zambianized logic and thus fulfill what you're asking for in a proper African reality to the language and to the logic of people in Zambia?
Right, thank you, Tim. Now, if we were to build a big wall around Zambia and cut English's links with the big wide world outside of Zambia, and if Zambians were to say, well, we're still going to run with English in our country, then in these days, the way English knowledge is widespread, maybe that would be a good competitor with other languages, although I doubt it, to be honest, because people are used to using English in certain circles and not the important circles. And it's kind of the image that comes to mind is a person without legs. You know, there's no play English, there's no argue with your husband English, there's not even perhaps barter on buying tomatoes English. It's just the chest rather than the legs. A large part of the problem with English is that it connects to other parts of the world who then think that they understand what is being said and respond to it in a way that implies comprehension, which then has massive, all kinds of effects. It means that the person who can speak fluent English becomes the most powerful person in the whole community. Everybody else, seeing that, wants all of their children to learn English, priority number 1. This is education, is English, because you might become like that person and they'll become incredibly powerful. So if English use in Africa was disconnected from the wide English speaking world, probably people would stop using it within days because of its disadvantages. But if they did want to use it and it become Africanized, that might be fine. But that's implied in what I said earlier, that we should stop thinking we understand what they're talking about.
Let me come in on that, Jim, because here's a related issue that I know from mission history in China. In Fujian, the missionaries were really set on only using local languages, and they wanted to establish schools that didn't use English but use Chinese only, because they really wanted to adopt and adapt a Chinese church for China. And this is among the Methodists. The problem the Methodists had was that Methodists, in terms of their polity, required that all members have an equal vote. Now, if you voted among the missionaries would have overwhelmingly and did overwhelmingly vote for Chinese-only education. It was the local population that insisted on Anglo-Chinese schools, and that won the day. And it was very frustrating for the missionaries, but for the Chinese, it was very, very practical. They knew that if their children were fluent in Chinese and fluent in English, this would open up opportunities and, you're right, power and wealth that they wanted to help alleviate the poverty and the situation of the people of Fujian. That led to a very vibrant Christian community that went throughout China, and the Fujianese to this day are known as one of the key areas of Christian influence. Now, they didn't drop their Chinese, they kept their Chinese going, but they saw that the missionaries brought with them tools that would allow a wider engagement with the world and ways that had practical use. You're probably right. If they closed down the Anglo-Chinese schools, they would have just gone back to the local dialects or to Putonghua, which is called High Chinese, but there's all kinds of Chinese, different dialects and things. But are we even in, if we pick up your solution, Jim, aren't we running the risk of a kind of strange colonialism where we dictate you should only learn your own language and we're not going to teach you English even if you want to learn?
Thank you, Tom. Well, I mean, some may realize if they're familiar with the principles of what we call vulnerable mission, that we're looking at two principles, local language and local resources. Now, clearly, at least in the context I'm familiar with, if you're endeavoring to invest in a project and you have locals on your committee, and particularly if they're in a majority, then they're going to go for English. So what we're talking about is an individual missionary. And then the question is, dear Chinese, or whoever it is, will you accept me living amongst you, working and ministering with you, if I use your own language? Now, if they say no, I mean, not that we should leave when the people tell us to leave, otherwise you would never go into any Muslim context in the first place. Mm-hmm. But we're not talking about a project being linked to this. We're not talking about a local committee. We're talking about an individual missionary who wants to work with people in their indigenous tongue and basically wants to confine themselves to work in that indigenous tongue. Is that neo-colonial? Well, if you want to take, say, Zambian people who go back to Zambia as having a right to English money, and every English person who's going to Zambia having an obligation to share English money with them, which is always empowering English people who go there, you can see it's neo-colonial, but really that is a neo-colonial that you're countering rather than you're instituting. Yeah. No, it's not neo-colonial. You're not forcing anybody. You're making a personal choice. I don't want the power and the identity that comes with my attempting to engage with you in English. I prefer to be a learner. Now, if I just add some context to this, I was in discussion with a Kenyan scholar recently, and for a little while on WhatsApp or something, I used English. And then he said, will you look at my paper in English? And I said, no. And he said, why? Well, you come from my village. You come from my area. If every other local person I engage in the Luo language, but when I meet you, I engage in English, and English is a language of gold, then other people will see that I'm being partial. I have to make a rule. I don't use English with anyone. Now, of course, marginal exceptions for a pragmatic reason, but really very marginal. Basically, I don't use English with anyone, or I have to use English with everyone. It's because it is a language of power, particularly when it comes from a British or American tongue. I mean, a German English speaker has less of an issue, for example, but we native English speakers, you can't be handing out $1,000 to one friend and give another one $5. It's not going to work. And that's what happens if you speak English to one and not to another. And if you use English, you have to do that, or you ignore those who are not good in English. They become then too low for you and you disengage with the upper class, but those who are too low for you are the ones you're going to learn from what's actually happening in the minds of those in the upper class. They're not going to reveal what's happening in the hearts and minds or in their community if you speak to them in English. So if you speak to them in English and that excludes you because you're busy using English, you don't have the time to use indigenous language. And for the other associated reasons, you don't get into the indigenous system, you can be on the mission field for 30 years and misdirecting projects and education and everything else for all of that time.
Yeah, that makes sense, Jim. I hear it. I think was a very different situation in Fujian back at the turn of the century, but I hear what you're saying. Yeah, it was a group of people that were actually kind of outcasts within Chinese. Chinese converts were often from the lower classes and the lower middle, or not even middle, and actually within their own Chinese framework were under the oppression of a class system. So English gave them avenues that they wouldn't have had otherwise. But that's a whole different kettle of fish. So yeah, but I appreciate what you're saying, Jim.
Before it leaves me, the one area which I just got completely confused about, I just couldn't quite catch the drift. How are you using the word anti-racism and how is it applying here? I couldn't decide whether you were for it, against it, or whether you were having a different interpretation of it or what. I just wonder if you could just explain how anti-racism fed into that your understanding.
Right, thank you, Tim. As I perceive from here, anti-racism epitomizes the worst possible kind of missionary practice, insofar as it's basically not treating them different, not treating as if they don't understand, not treating as if they're not one of us. So you use English, we expect them to participate in the same educational processes, we expect them to earn the same amount of money when they're doing the job, which if you do that in Africa, then you are spreading money everywhere because, you know, salary differences are between a factor of 10 and a factor of 40. But if we do that in the West again, if you put a wall around the West and say the people of African origin in the UK have equal salaries to people in the native British people, you say, well, that's fine. But there's no wall. So children in, let's say, Tanzania again, who realize their friend who knows English is now earning 40 times as much as they are because of English, they're all not dragged into English, they're hammered into English because every little boy wants to get that high-paying job. And it's not worth, again, considering your indigenous issues and how your own people might overcome them, the only thing that's worth doing is latching on to that indecipherable, doesn't make sense to you, but powerful English-speaking world. So I'm not saying we should be racist. It's a puzzle, but yet I am saying that anti-racism in the West, as I perceive it, epitomizes the worst in missionary practice. And to some extent, it has to be the model, because when a missionary comes from US, UK to Zambia, they've been brought up on what anti-racism says should be intercultural relationship. And that's the model they instinctively apply. And it often takes many years for them to realize it doesn't work.
That's very helpful. As I say, I was completely confused.
Thank you.
Oh, Al, go ahead.
Can we come back? Because this is so fascinating. And thank you, Riyadh. But I can't help but feel that somehow the African situation and Latin American is so different. I mean, obviously in Latin America, you never get missionaries coming and doing ministry in English. So that's out of the question. Way back, that kind of idea disappeared. But what we now have, and of course, Riyadh is right that there was a blanket exterminating almost of cultures. But of course, cultures don't die that easily. And nowadays, as you know, Guarani never died. And now certainly the 8 groupings in Chile and in Bolivia have all flourished again and are well on the way to coming back. But what I'm interested in is the fact that, I mean, Bible translation is in no way done by English people. The Chileans translating the scriptures together with Mapudungun. And so when they get their scriptures in their own language, churches become entirely indigenous. And especially, this power issue. Yeah, languages are power issues, somehow we're talking about, but Pentecostals seem to break through these power issues. And so you get whole groupings of indigenous peoples with the scriptures in their language that have become entirely Pentecostal. In the north, you get indigenous groups who seem to have broken through this power issue. Spanish is a lingua franca, of course, has become that, but increasingly universities and schools now will be teaching these languages. It just interests me, the relationship between the way, as you said, grace, the scriptures, particularly from the Reformation on, began to build Europe. To what extent should we look more to that? As you were saying, you were proposing that theology would be more directive in the ways we handle these issues, that we don't be so complex about it. But in Latin America, I don't see that this power element to language is hampering mission. On the contrary, that when they do get the scripture, that these cultures in their languages run. I mean, I remember taking an Englishman to an Anglican church in the south of Chile, Mapudungun, and the service was all in Mapudungun. It lasted 5 hours. Halfway through, the prophetesses prophesied, and it was an Anglican service, all in Mapudungun. And then he said, imagine this in Westminster Abbey. There'd been a cultural breakthrough through having the scriptures in their own language. I mean, maybe just comment on that. Probably Africa is so different that you can't relate it.
Thank you, Alfred. Africa is very different. I mean, I understand one of the basic differences. Latin America is primarily governed by people of European origin. And then you have the native tribes under them, if you like, whereas here, the native tribes are running the countries.
Right.
It seems what you're telling me is what I'm saying. I mean, the local people thrive when they use their own language. Let the missionary get on board.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is what I'm saying.
They have done. Right.
Right. Well, then they're doing a great job if they're getting on board.
Well, that's happened for years now.
Well, it isn't in Africa. I mean,
okay.
Now, of course, there's many people around Africa I'm not familiar with, but it's very, very hard to find one person who has anything like local fluency in African languages. Tanzania, to some extent, an exception. You have European folks there who do learn Swahili. 1 or 2 Tanzanian missionaries and others missionaries to Tanzania have said to me, Jim, don't think that we really understand. So even there, the fluency is limited. Tanzania itself is moving towards English for various reasons. It's going to become more difficult to do that in Tanzania as secondary schooling is booming and it's in English. So the secondary school students and graduates will be intercepting your missions to say, no, you can use English, we know English. And they'll be tempted to do exactly that by listening to the native. When it comes to missionary vulnerability, and one part of that is language, let's say we mustn't listen to the native. They want power, unless we want to play power games. Jesus didn't play power games and they hated him for it. Well, if they don't like us, we're not there to represent UK and its powerful connections. We're there to represent Jesus. So we have to say, I'm going to use only this indigenous language.
Right. Stop English.
Okay, let's go up to, I'm going to go with Nydia first and then Israel. Go ahead, Nydia.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm not turning my camera off because I have a slight fever, but I'm following the topic and just wanted to comment on aspects of English speaking in Latin America and the effect it has. And for example, the church that we go to at the end at the church, there's a table with books that people can borrow. And I would say 70% of the authors are from the West, but the books have been translated to Spanish. I would also argue that sometimes Latin Americans think that a Western teacher, let's say somebody like Mick, what's his last name? He has a school, MacArthur. I think it's MacArthur.
John MacArthur.
John MacArthur.
And he
Or
has
Tim
schools.
Keller.
He has a big influence in Latin American theology, and I've never studied him, but I know that he's mentioned often. He obviously uses translators, but most of the resources that are used from the John MacArthur School have been written in English and then translated to Spanish. Now there's the complexity of why is, in general, we in our education, we are not taught how to write from elementary school. We're just taught to copy. I remember copying stories from the book to the notebook until my hands were I don't know if Al, what was your experience growing up, but all we did was copy. And when I saw how different the Western, when I saw how our sons were the elementary teaching, how they incorporated critical reading and writing from the beginning, I started to understand the differences. So I think that's another factor to consider in influencing the Latin American church. It takes many resources to produce writings, and so if that's not there, then how is information and theology going to influence the church? And another aspect is, I have heard, so in Wycliffe, I'm a member of Wycliffe, and sometimes the way that the donor requests information about the project that they're supporting is through written reports. And that is a big obstacle to Spanish speakers or indigenous speakers, because they would be more than happy to tell a story, record a WhatsApp voicemail, rather than just sitting down and reporting. So those kinds of issues are constantly interplaying in the English, Spanish, indigenous languages in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Nydia. Yeah, I mean, Latin America, I'm not familiar with, again, the Spanish and English, they're neighbors, you know, they're neighboring European languages, although they're quite different in a number of respects. Donors requiring written reports. I mean, what I would like to suggest is that some missionaries disconnect from that world of donors requiring written reports and determining and dictating what happens, not to attack it, but to disconnect from it. Now, that disconnect has a number of implications. We need to be friendly, but these foreign donors are often looking for trustworthy people to tell them the key knowledge. And if you become that trustworthy person because you happen to have local knowledge and you tell the donor, then you actually become implicated in the way the donor funds are used. So you have to disconnect from that whole donor-oriented network. Availability of theology. Now, I mean, many in Africa are kind of inundated with, well, it's not many because most don't take much interest in it, but there's a lot of Western theology floating around. Sometimes you kind of say, well, yeah, that's distracting all the young men. So instead of trying to engage their own issues as they're perceived by their own people, they spend years and years of their lives learning Western theology and then can't contribute to indigenous issues in the first place. And as I indicated in the presentation, if this is one institution doing this, you could kind of say, well, okay, we'll forget it. Every institution, I believe in Kenya, it is illegal, basically, to teach other than in English. Tanzania is losing the battle. Zambia must be the same. You can't. It's illegal to make sense. It's illegal to speak what is in your head. You have to imitate the white man all the time. Now, that's in a sense their issue. We've pushed them into it with our linked finance, we as Westerners. And what I'm suggesting is some missionaries need to sidestep that and take indigenous people seriously on their own terms. And then, I mean, in my experience, it's very hard for me to contribute theologically. Now I teach the Bible. I don't know how it goes home. That's God's Holy Spirit's work. But I don't have great, profound theological thoughts in another sense, because I'm still struggling to find out where on earth are the indigenous people I'm relating to in their own thinking in order to find something to connect to. And that's after 34 years of using indigenous languages in Africa.
Let's go with Israel. Israel, go ahead.
Okay, Jim, thank you for your presentation on these thoughts. And as several people have said, the different context, it seems to me they have different challenges and different history and different time in history. And this picture you draw or present about Africa, for me, is a kind of shocking. I thought that was 100 years ago in the colonial time. Many in Latin America, in Peru, because sometimes I think we have to be careful about talking about Latin America. It's a huge continent, and there are differences between Chile and Argentina and Peru. So, talking about Peru, the Anglo missionaries have almost gone. There are not many, very few, almost gone. So that issue you present is quite difficult to figure out today for us. But there is other levels and where I could think about this issue. For example, being bilingual in many of our many of the countryside or the mountains, the highlands of Peru and the jungle, we have different languages, not an African language or a Peruvian language. We have different Peruvian languages. So we need to find a way to interact with each other. And the only way to interact with each other is Spanish. So for me, it seems that language is more like a tool than a way to express dominance. But maybe people do that. So I was thinking, Jim, if you're talking more about attitudes, because you talk about humility and things like that, vulnerability. You're thinking more about attitudes that, for example, interact with common languages. Spain is an example of it. I've been living in Spain several years, and in the Catalonia area, we have Catalan and Spanish, and people are bilingual. So if we say, no, you have to only think and believe in Catalan, and you make, no, I will make this theology in Spanish, we might miss the natural environment and context of unity between these two languages in a bilingual context. That could be my comment.
Jim?
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim. Did we lose you or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, he was freezing there, so I probably didn't get everything.
Yeah, but basically, it was just talking about language as a tool, and that between Catalan and Spanish-speaking people in Spain, when they talk to each other, they will find a common language, and that'll be Spanish. But if you insisted on only Catalan, then the communications would break down.
Right. I mean, perhaps an example that would illustrate what's happening in Africa. Let's imagine now that the UK government has decided that the national language for English is to be Swahili. So all nursery schools will start teaching in Swahili. Swahili will be phased into government in the next 10 years. Until in 10 years' time, the parliament will only operate in Swahili. Businesses beyond a certain date, English will no longer be considered legitimate and for legal purposes, blah, blah, blah. What would happen? Number one, all Tanzanians would get, it doesn't float in ether, to know what you say and shouldn't say, you have to ask a Tanzanian. So they'd get the prime jobs. The theories of Adam Smith, the Enlightenment philosophers, would all become illegitimate because the foundation they're building are not there, and Swahili Enlightenment would disappear. They talk with their grandchildren. It would be a disaster, and no one would seriously ask England to do that, but England asks other people to do exactly, basically that. Suggested anyway, within a particular country, to use a unifying language, if I give the example of Swahili in Tanzania, where there are 120 languages, but Swahili unifies them, I stand with Swahili in many ways because they're a political unit and they're of comparable cultures. If, on the other hand, Swahili was to, Tanzania is to adopt German, it'd be a totally different ball game because now the experts are no longer, they're now 5,000 miles away, and English falls in that category. I'm not very familiar with the Spanish-speaking world. I think the English-speaking world is much more dominating over their language users than with the Spanish-speaking world. Because you have and Australia and others. I would imagine in Latin America, there's a certain degree of freedom use Spanish the way you like, which though in other respects there are many relevancy because it's in the language, supernatural because it's in the language. They don't know what they're talking about, but they're using the term because it's in their language. Now it happens to me, of course, when I speak in the Luo language. I hear people use a term, I use a term. And when I use a term, I look in their eyes and I see them looking at me thinking, Jim, you don't know what you're talking about, do you? And I kind of have to say, I don't. But yet we say they do. So we take them seriously. So if someone learns English in Zambia, they come to UK, we listen to them in English. Now there is, in a sense, of course, I'm speaking very offensively because the whole anti-racism thing and so on is against this. It's this dream, this myth of multilingualism and multiculturalism that kind of enables the West to function by killing off everybody else's capability, runs to the contrary. But as I indicated before, if you do that, then you're killing mission. What serious young person is going to go and learn another language when the person from that language is taken seriously in their own country? Even, it just doesn't make sense when you look at it carefully. You put it that way.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim. I think it was a fascinating conversation. And it's interesting, whenever you get into mission, especially Protestant mission, everything has to do with the translation of the word and also of the vernacular. And so these are issues that are going to stay with us. And you've brought some really important ones to the fore, especially in terms of Africa, but also the conversation about how that appears in different contexts. Well, with that, thank you very much. And I will close off this conversation and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. And again, thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you, everybody. Good to see you all. Thank you for your questions and discussion.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, don Israel. Muy bien lo que dijo usted.